Roman numeral 1, the French and Indian War. This is our first lecture in a unit that is dealing with American history from 1754 to 1800. So our first lecture in this series is going to deal with the French and Indian War. It is going to be a conflict that's going to take place on the American frontier between American colonists, their Native American allies, and the French Empire and their Native American allies, as we can see in this picture. So let's go into the causes. So when you think about a war in this course, you're going to need to know a few things, right? First of all, you're going to need to know the causes. Then you're going to need to know what happened. And then, of course, you should know, most importantly, perhaps, maybe the effects of the war, how it is going to change American history. Because in this country's history, wars have acted as a catalyst for change. They've sped things up that may have occurred naturally anyway, maybe not, but they're certainly speeding things up for us to have to face certain issues. So let's start with number one, national rivalries as a cause. As the English colonies continue to grow and become more and more successful, they are looking for, of course, a way to make money. And what we see here is the English colonies right here. They're making money off of fisheries that are off the coast here, and they're looking for lumber that's in the forest, and most importantly, they're looking for furs. So we see that the colonies are growing. This is certainly, 100 years plus past founding in many of the colonies, and so we have this burgeoning, growing population that is looking to get wealthy. But France is also on the continent of North America, and they are in this area right here, and they're primarily making money in the New World off of furs. And so we see that these two rival nations back in Europe see North America as a resource that they both want to take as much money as possible out of. And when nations fighting over resources, of course, or they want the same resource, that leads to war. This ties in with the concept of mercantilism, that the idea there's only so much wealth in the world, and the more my country gets, the bigger the share of my pie piece of the world's wealth, and that means that my enemy's pie piece is going to get smaller if my pie piece gets bigger, like if you're cutting a pie. And so we see that this concept of national rivalries for resources is going to be one of the factors leading to war. Now, another factor leading to war, as I said, is population growth. The colonies are getting more successful, which means more people are coming here, more people are living, and so the colonists need more land, especially the people over here in Virginia. A lot of the land that's been used for growing tobacco has already been used up. Right here along the border, that's the Appalachian Mountains, and that's not great for growing tobacco. And so we're going to see that the English colonists in Virginia want to go west into the Ohio River Valley, which is this area right here. Right, this is the Ohio River Valley. It is currently populated by Native Americans and their French allies who have traded with them for furs. And so we see that the English want to go into there. Yes, the English want furs too, but a large reason the Virginia population wants to spill over into French territory or the Ohio River Valley is because they want to use it for farmland. Now, of course, the French can't allow this to happen. The French are concerned that if we get English settlers coming in here, they're going to start to chop down the forest. They're going to start to turn it into farmland, which is going to hurt the fur trade. They may ally with natives in the area for the fur trade, and so this is going to impact the French's economy. And so, of course, there's friction that's going to develop here. So we need some kind, so these are the underlying causes, and so let's now look at what is the spark that sets off the war. Well, so the government of Virginia have, one, decided that they want to send an expedition out into the Ohio River Valley to look and maybe do some land speculation, to go and, survey or plot out some land or lay claim to some land for tobacco. In addition to that, there's been some attacks on English people that have been going out there for the fur trade. And so we see that they send the colonial government of Virginia sends a young planter out west with a group of 100 or so militia members from Virginia to go see what's going on in the Ohio River Valley, plot out some land, and assert English interests there. And of course, this is led by a young George Washington. And so, like I said, he's going to lead about 100 or so of these militia members, and they're going to go across the Appalachian Mountains into the Ohio River Valley. Now, in the area that they're going, there is a French fur trading fort there, and it's called Fort Duquesne. And so here's Fort Duquesne, and the French, of course, are going to find out that there's an English expedition into the region because the French have really good friends that are Indian allies that are allied together because of the fur trade. And so the Native Americans are going to go tell the French that the English are in the area. And so long story short, these two forces will come together, and the French will attack after a skirmish among the English, George Washington and his militia members. There's a small skirmish, and then they know that the French are aware of their presence, so they build this hasty fort called Fort Necessity. They just kind of threw it up and like, oh my gosh, we're in enemy territory. We better put up a fort if we can. The French and their Indian allies surround the fort, and the George Washington and his troops are eventually defeated. They're outmanned. They're surrounded. They're a long ways away from home. And so eventually George Washington is allowed to surrender, and he and his surviving men have to go back to Virginia. They have to promise not to come back. Of course, that's not going to happen. And so this word of this conflict out in the woods of North America is going to eventually make its way to the rest of the colonies and the French area. And so this is going to ignite the French and Indian War. And then eventually, 2 years later, this is going to actually ignite a whole world war between the British Empire and the French Empire back in Europe and then around their colonies all over the world. And so let's talk about the war. So those were the underlying causes and the spark that started the war. Now let's talk about the war itself. Well, we're not going to go into too many battles and those kinds of details. Suffice to say that the conflict, we need to talk about the sides. And so we have the English colonials on one side and their Native American allies, and then we have the French coureurs de bois, if you remember, those are the French fur traders, on the other side with their Indian allies. And so we see that the French and Indian War is not just going to be between European and French, and it's not going to be between European and Native American. It's also going to be an intertribal conflict, depending on what side of a Native American you've chosen. And this is an example of how colonization is impacting the natives, because it's increasing their intertribal warfare, and they're trying. And these Native American tribes this is their agency, right? This is their ability to try to control their own destiny. And so they play European sides off against each other during the fur trade. Like if I'm a Native American tribe and I find out that the French are not going to give me as much money or guns or whatever trade goods as I want for furs, maybe I'll go to the English. And so we see the Native Americans traditionally have had these shifting alliances, trying to figure out what's best for their tribe between English and French and Dutch. But as this war starts, we see that they have to pick a side, typically throughout the war. Sometimes they'll switch. And so we see that this is a large conflict between Europeans and natives and natives and natives on the frontier. Since this is frontier fighting for the most part, it's going to be what we call guerrilla warfare. There's not going to be any set army that goes out and meets another set army in traditional battles the way Europeans know them. It's going to be hit and run tactics. English, along with their Indian allies, might hit a French settlement and then go back into the woods, or they might hit an Indian village, a Native American village, and go back into the woods, and vice versa. So lots of people are going to get attacked in this war that aren't soldiers, that they're just settlers, or they're women and children, or they're people that didn't think they were going to be in part of the conflict as part of this guerrilla warfare wages and flares up all up and down the Appalachian Mountains and in the Ohio River Valley. Here's an example of one specific village that's going to be attacked. So Deerfield, Massachusetts is in western Massachusetts, and the French and their native allies, they know about this, and so the Native Americans will go out and they'll attack this frontier settlement in Massachusetts and completely wipe out the town. And so this is a great example of these hit-and-run tactics, attacking not just warriors of the other side, but also the women and children as well. Now, as the war is really getting started, the English government says to the American colonists, look, we got our own problems, right? We don't have time to send a lot of troops at this point to the colonies to protect you. And so we want you guys to come together and figure out your own defense. we have had an era of neglect going on right here, the era of salutary neglect. England is just kind of leaving the colonists to their own affairs. And so, upon England's urging, the colonies, some of them say, yeah, we should have a meeting to try to figure out what to do here. And so what they decide to do is they'll meet in Albany. Albany is kind of up here in the frontier of the New York colony. And they send the word out to the colonists, let's come together and plan a defense. Also, Iroquois Indians, Native Americans, come to the meeting because those are the traditional allies of the English. Indian allies, Native American allies at the time. And so that's what the meeting is supposed to be planned for, this like planning our mutual defense. Only 7 of the 13 colonies show up. So that tells you kind of the degree of colonial unity at this point. Even in the face of attacks by the French and the Native Americans, only 7 of the 13 kind of trust each other or care enough about each other to actually send representatives to this meeting. Now, as we go through this unit, you'll find that colonial unity is going to gradually increase until we have meetings where all 13 colonies come together. But those are different lectures. And so 7 colonies come, and so do the Iroquois natives. And so what we see here is, like I said, they're trying to get a mutual defense. But there is a representative here from Pennsylvania. His name is Benjamin Franklin. Obviously, we'll talk a lot more about him in future lectures. And so Benjamin Franklin sees this as an opportunity to do something even more than what the purpose of the meeting was. He thinks that this is a great opportunity for making a permanent, united colonial government, not just for this crisis, but for the future as well. He has written, and he believes that really the future of the British Empire lies not in England, but here in North America, because the population is growing fast. It's a huge area. They have a lot more natural resources than the people back in England do, and he envisions in his mind that someday, that as more and more English people move to the colonies and they grow and prosper, that really the capital of the British Empire will be moved to the colonies. And so he sees this amazing future for the colonies, and so he wants to kind of shepherd us down that road. And so he proposes that there be a permanent, united government to help not just protect the colonies, but guide their development and help them be great. As part of this, he doesn't want the king to think that they're trying to break away or anything like that. That's not his plan. And so he says, we'll create kind of a colonial legislature that will represent all of the colonies and make decisions for the colonies as a group, kind of like a Congress. But so that the king also knows that he has part of this, just kind of like back in England with Parliament and the king sharing power, is the king will appoint a president that will then be the executive over this new united government. And so we kind of have this sharing of power, which is very traditionally English. Like I said, this is what's going on in England between the Parliament there and England. So we're going to have kind of a Parliament here that the king will be able to take part in through his appointed representative. Now, to convince people that this is a good idea, he's a newspaper editor, Ben Franklin, and so he uses what newspapers sometimes do. He uses pictures to try to relay his message, because that's easy to understand, right? And so he puts this cartoon out there among the people going to the meeting and other people, and he says, join or die. So it's a pretty famous political cartoon. And he's trying to say, look, as if we all join together, and you can see the parts of the snake, New England, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, etc., etc. Like, if we all come together, we will be successful. But if we don't come together for our mutual defense, for our mutual future success, we will die. And so this is, he's trying to get people to support his Albany plan, which is what this is called. Everybody rejects it, however. The people in the Albany Congress themselves say, no, right, we're not going to do this, right? Because the colonists have all been founded separately. They kind of think of themselves as separate anyway. Not separate countries, because they all believe they're still loyal colonies to the British Crown at this point, but they have religious differences between each other. Sometimes they have land conflicts. Pennsylvania and Maryland or Pennsylvania and New York may claim the same land. They have different economies. They have different ethnic groups that live there. And so to come together at this point, the colonies are like, no, why would I as a Pennsylvania person come together with Virginia? I don't like them. I don't trust them. They're a different religious sect of Christianity, or they have these different weird views or whatever. And so it's really hard to get them to agree to bind themselves together and to make decisions as a group. And so the colonies just reject the plan outright. But Ben Franklin's not going to give up. He sends the plan to England. Maybe England will like this plan. But England also rejects the plan. They said, look, we wanted you to call the Albany Congress to get together to plan defense for this crisis, the French and Indian War, but not for permanent, because they're afraid that if the colonies come together permanently, that might lead to independence down the road. And they're like, no, you're not going to do this. So his plan goes nowhere. But it's a great example, the Albany Plan, of just the amount, the degree of colonial unity we see. And like I said, we will track that as we go through this unit to see how it comes slowly more and more and more together until the colonies are a united force with all 13 of them later on. Next, let's go to what the colonists notice about the English during this war. So as the war drags on and then starts over in Europe, the English find some time to spare some troops. And so they realize that if they're going to hold on to these English colonies, not let the French take over some of their colonies in the New World, they're going to have to send troops. And so the English do send some British redcoats, right? They send some British regular army troops over here. And when they join the colonists, at first the colonists are overjoyed that their mother country cares about them, and finally the mighty British Army and Navy is going to come and protect them and do what a mother country should do. But then this develops some friction, because remember, the English have ignored the colonists for a really long time. It's been the era of salutary neglect. And so this is like the first real sustained contact we've had with the British government for a while. And so let's look at some of the things that rub the colonists kind of wrong. So we're going to start over here with severe discipline, right? So the British army that comes over here, the officers are upper class gentlemen, and you had to have a certain amount of social status to be an officer in the British Army. You had to be from the gentry class, the noble class. And you had to buy your position. It wasn't necessarily through experience or because you did a good job. And so these guys are very class oriented. And then the rank and file of the British Army are the lower classes of British society. A lot of times it was either, if you're in jail, you can be hanged or you can join the British Army. And so there's a very noticeable class difference. And so the discipline in the British Army is really severe. For small infractions, if you don't have your collar buttoned up all the way, your uniform isn't as neat, those kind of small infractions, then the officers would mete out severe punishments like floggings or whippings right there. Well, this is just not at all how the colonial militias do their army units, right? A militia is made up of the people of a town or a settlement, and they come together willingly in defense of the town. They usually elect their own officers, right? Somebody who's respected and a leader in the community. And so the colonial militia's officers would never whip their soldiers because they wouldn't be the officers anymore. There's too much democracy here, right? The people, the militia soldiers, which is like, well, we just chose you. We can choose somebody else. And so we're aghast at this class difference that we see in the British Army and the severe discipline. And so this is the beginnings of the colonists starting to realize that maybe we're not as British as we thought we were, right? Maybe we're something different. And so we start to see the small gap widening in people's minds about being English at all. All right, and so that's one thing. Another thing, let's go down here, is that the British Army has a total lack of respect in many cases for the colonials. Right? So here's a great example of that, because the British are from the mother country. And who are these local colonials that didn't go to Oxford, right? They didn't go to Cambridge to school. They're not in the king's court. Who are they to be equal to us? And so we have, because England at this time is very class conscious, and so we see there's this separation. And so here's George Washington, right? He already has some military experience fighting on the frontier. He was there at the beginning of this war. And so he's a rich gentleman. He's a plantation owner, a tobacco farmer. He's well thought of. He has a lot of high social standing in Virginia. And so he really wants to be an officer in the British Army. And so he writes to the British Army and says, I have experience, kind of like trying to get the job. And would you give me a commission? Would you make me an officer? And they're like, no, we're not going to make you an officer. You're just a colonial. Who are you? You're not even a part of British society. And this creates a lot of deep-seated anger in George Washington. We start to see the beginnings of that even the elite of the colonies realize, well, why should I be a loyal English subject when they don't respect me? Now, we're not talking that the British colonies are ready for rebellion yet, but the seed has been planted in people's minds that they might be different than the people of the mother country. We're British subjects, but maybe we're different than them. And so, that's always the first step down the road to revolution. So I don't want you to think that we're ready to revolt yet. It's just we're starting to realize it's kind of an us-them kind of thing starting in people's minds. Then the last thing we see is the fighting itself. And so the colonists, the colonial militias, the town units, they're used to fighting quote unquote Indian style. They're used to fighting frontier style. How the natives, the indigenous peoples fight on the frontier, right? It's all about guerrilla warfare. It's sneak attacks. It's using camouflage, hiding behind things to fire and then melt back into the woods. And so that's how they're used to fighting, because they know that's how the natives fight and the French fight in the New World. And so when the British Army comes to the New World, they're like, okay, we're the best military here. They fight in traditional European style. They have these nice red uniforms that are totally going to stick out in the green forest. They fight in formal formations of lines. They all fire together, and they think it's cowardly to fight with guerrilla tactics. They think it's cowardly to hide behind trees and bushes and rocks and logs. And so when there's a battle that happens in the forest, the colonial militia do what they're used to. They duck and cover, right, and try to return fire. And the British just look at them with disdain, and they're not shy about showing this disdain, like, you cowards. And so we start to see that the colonies start to lose a little bit of respect for the English because they don't treat them well, and they're not using common sense, and they're not listening to us when we tell them this is how you fight. And so again, it's this widening gap that's just barely starting between the colonies and Mother England. So the war is dragging on, and these tactics that the British are using are not working. Of these, send in the army with these formations. And because the frontier, the fighting on the frontier, it's all up and down the frontier. This is the front of the fighting. And it's happening in Indian villages, native villages, and it's happening in English towns, in French settlements. And there's, it's a huge area. They're just dispersed. And there's no way the British Army is ever going to be able to conquer the Ohio River Valley in its entirety. It's just too big of a territory. And so what we realize is there's a new prime minister in England, and his name is William Pitt. And so he decides to take a different strategy, because what we're doing on the frontier of all of these different battlefronts is just, it's not what we're going to do to win. So he takes the Navy, and the Navy gives the Army a ride, as they do. And what they do is they go up here and they attack the French city of Quebec. They conquer it, and then they go up here, they take the capital, they take the city of Montreal. Now, these two cities are strategically important because they overlook the St. Lawrence Seaway. This is the St. Lawrence Seaway here, and it leads into the Ohio River Valley. And so his strategy is, if we take these two towns that overlook the St. Lawrence Seaway, we can put cannons there or take the French cannons, and now no French will be able to get in or out, which of course is very important for the French. The French are here for money, right? The French have a New World colony, so they can get furs to make money, and that's why the whole colony is there. Well, if you can't get furs out, and you can't get supplies for the war in, because this is the only kind of highway in to the Ohio River Valley, then the French are going to be long-term stuck, and they're going to just run out of ammunition, the French are going to run out of money, and so this was William Pitt's strategy, and it totally works. So eventually, the French are going to lose the war in the North American continent, as well as they're losing the war in the other parts of the world as well, because this is kind of a world war. So this leads to victory. So at the end of the war, in Europe, they're going to sit around a peace table. The French and the British and other countries were involved by now too, Spain, and they're going to trade bits and pieces of the world for whatever benefits the mother country. And so this is what happens kind of at the peace table, and how it benefits or not the British Empire. So what we see here on the left is a map of North America pre-war, right? The green area is New Spain. The orange area is claimed by the British. And then this area right here with this kind of yellowish color, that is going to be New France territory. All right, now, so that's how it looks before the war. And so we'll get to what the text is in a second. But let's look back at this, right? So now on the right-hand side, at the peace table, the French have to give up all of their land in North America as a result of losing the war. And so now all of this is British territory. No French territory whatsoever left. And so the British are going to gain a huge amount of territory. That's one effect of the war. Another effect of the war is that during the war, the British are starting to enforce the Navigation Acts again, which is controlling who the colonists can trade with. They're only supposed to trade with Mother England. They're only supposed to buy stuff from Mother England. But the colonists want to trade with whoever they want to trade with, whoever's going to give them the best price for their goods, whoever's going to sell them the stuff for the least amount. And so during the war, the colonists were actually trading with their French enemies because it's business, right? It's money. Or they were trading with the Spanish. And this really ticked off the mother country because from their vantage point, they're like, look, we're sending troops to defend you and to defend the empire, and this is the thanks we get. You're trading with the enemy? And so they're very mad about this. Like, this has to stop. And so one of the effects of the French and Indian War being over is that the era of salutary neglect is going to come to an end, which is a time where the English just kind of leave the colonies to their own devices. Because this war has shown that the colonies cannot be trusted to only trade with Mother England and benefit Mother England. They're going to do what's good for themselves, the colonies, and we can't have that. They have to follow British imperial policy. And so this is going to be a change, right? Next, we're going to see is that the British are in debt from the war. And this is maybe the biggest effect of the war, is that, the British were already in debt. We haven't talked about this, but the British have fought several wars against the French in the preceding years. And so wars are expensive, and the British government has racked up a huge debt. And this was a very big war, and so they rack up an even bigger debt. And so the British government, they've already taxed the people of England a lot for the previous wars, but because of the era of salutary neglect, they really haven't taxed the colonies very much. They've kind of left them alone. And so from the British viewpoint, well, this makes sense. We fought this war to protect the colonies. We sent troops to protect the colonies. The colonies are now benefited now because there's no longer a French threat anymore in North America, right? The colonists don't have to worry about the French here anymore, right? Because the French are gone. And so they don't, thanks to us, we got rid of the French quote-unquote menace. And so this is to the colonies' benefit. So they totally should pay for some of this war. So we're going to raise taxes on the colonists. This is going to be the first time they've raised taxes in a long time, right? And so they're going to tax the colonists. Of course, this is going to make the colonists mad because they haven't been taxed in a long time. So if you go from being neglected to all of a sudden being taxed, that's going to make you angry. All right. Next, we're going to see that the British themselves, wanting money, they have kicked the French out of the Ohio River Valley. There's still furs there. And so the English businessmen are going to try to take over where the French left. And so English fur businesses, they're going to send representatives to the Ohio River Valley, and they're going to say to the natives there, look, your French trading partners had to leave, but we're here to trade with you. We'll give you guns. We'll give you metal tools and other products if you give us furs. And so the natives are like, okay, I guess that's to our benefit. We still need guns, and plus, your colonists keep trying to enter our territory. So yeah, we need guns anyway. And so this war really highlights that that the views and the interests of Mother England are going to be different than the views and the interests of her colony, and that's going to start to widen the gap. Like I said a few slides ago, it's going to make an us-them kind of situation going. We're not all united English people. We have different interests than them. We are treated differently than them. We live differently than them. And so this war kind of brings that to people's minds. All right, now as they start this thing, so the British are like, okay, we want to trade furs with the natives to make some money back from this war, but the English colonists, like, well, we fought this war so that we could move west, right? If you remember George Washington, we fought this war so we could have land to grow tobacco and have more land for settlement. And now that the French are gone, we defeated their Indian allies, it's time to move west. But that contradicts what the British want. The British want to keep their own colonists out so they can trade furs with the natives to make money. And so we have conflicting interests. So the British government passes something called the Proclamation of 1763. And basically, you can see it on this right-hand map. It draws this blue line. It draws a line down the Appalachian Mountains and says everything west of that line is going to be area reserved for Native Americans. And it's not like they're looking out for the Native Americans. It's because they want to trade furs with the Native Americans. And they can't do that if there's a flood of colonists coming over the Appalachian Mountains to take their land. And so there's like, okay, on the left-hand side to the west of this is going to be Native American territory that we can get furs from. To the right, our colonists they have enough land, right? They're fine. And they have to keep themselves on the right-hand side of this line. And so this is another point of friction between the colonies and Mother England, the Proclamation of 1763, and now also taxation. So this gets us to another effect of the war, changing colonial attitudes. And I've tried to make this point on the previous slide, is that the colonists realize the British interests do not match theirs. Right? The colonists want to push further west. They want to cross that proclamation of 1763. Here we see Daniel Boone in this picture leading people west because that's what they thought they fought the war for. And, we need land. We want land. And our French enemies are defeated and their Native American allies are defeated, so we're going to go take that land. And so here's a specific example of this. So in western Pennsylvania, we see a group of Scotch-Irish. Now, the Scotch-Irish we've already talked about, they have migrated to America to get away from England because they've had lots of conflicts with the English in the past. Because they're Scottish, and then they were Irish, and both of them has conflicts with the English. And so they settled on the frontier to get as way far from the British Empire as possible. And so when the war is over, these Scotch-Irish frontiermen, they're like, okay, let's go get some of that land. And then we have this proclamation of 1763 where the English are starting to say and then saying that, oh, you can't go west. That really makes these Scotch-Irish mad. And so they want to go get that land. And so they're like, well, let's go kill some Native Americans. And so they know that the closest set of Native Americans to them that they could attack are these peaceful natives that have decided to live among the English in Pennsylvania. And so they go attack them, and we can see this in this picture. And then they say, we're going to march on the government of Pennsylvania, and we're going to let them know that we are upset. We're going to attack them, and we're going to violently protest. So here's an example already of the colonists not only continuing violence with Native Americans, but also trying to flout the authority of the British colonial government in the colony of Pennsylvania. And so we see this is a frontier conflict, the Paxton Boys, but it's also a kind of a backcountry poor person rebellion against the Eastern elite and the British authority itself. All right, and so also it's another example of colonists realizing that the British interests do not match their own, is that as the English are going to start to raise taxes, and as the English are going to start to make this proclamation line, they're going to realize again that our interests are not theirs, right? We don't want to pay taxes, right? We fought in this war too, and we should be able to get the fruits of our labor. We should be able to go get that land, and we shouldn't be taxed. And so we see that these issues, the Proclamation of 1763, the new taxes that are going to be put into place, how we saw that the British looked down upon us in the war, all of these things are going to start agitating the colonists and making them think, well, maybe we shouldn't be loyal citizens anymore. All right. Next, how does the war change Native Americans? Well, of course the war is going to change Native Americans, because in the past, they could kind of play one European power off against another, right? They could play the French off against the English. If the French don't want to give us enough muskets or medals for these furs, maybe the English will. And so we have the natives traditionally kind of over time, now and again, shifting alliances from one European to another. Or they would use the French as a way to kind of help keep the English colonists at bay by getting guns and weapons from the French in return for their furs. But now the French are completely gone, right? And so the natives, they can't play this game of let's go to whoever treats us better, because they can only trade with the English now. And so we see that the amount of stuff they get, the amount of guns and finished goods that they get from their furs is now limited. It's going down. And so they have fewer and fewer options to defend themselves. Right? The Native Americans also are going to have to deal with this increasingly large tide of British colonists moving over the Appalachian Mountains and ignoring the Proclamation of 1763, because they do. And so they write letters, they plead with the British government, look, you said you're going to protect us and trade with us, but you're not doing it. The British are like, we're trying. And so we see that now the Native Americans are going to have to deal with all of these colonists moving over. And so the French-Indian War does not turn out well for the natives. So what do? So we get this Native American, his name is Chief Pontiac, and he's in the Ohio River Valley, and he sees what's happening, right? It's 1763, the war is over, and he sees this tide of English colonists flooding over the Appalachian Mountains to take his land. And so here you see him at this meeting. All of these guys are tribal chiefs. And he says, I know we haven't always gotten along in the past because we've been rival tribes, but let's create a pan-Indian alliance. Let's all come together. And he's pointing east because the colonists are coming. And if we don't band together right now, we're going to lose everything. And so we see right after the French and Indian War is over, boom, another conflict on the frontier. This time there's no French involved, right? It's between the Native Americans and the colonists that are coming over into the Ohio River Valley. And so we see once again conflict on the frontier. So as the colonists do this, they're gonna try to kill the natives as much as possible, and vice versa. It says biological warfare right here because the colonists are aware that smallpox and measles are a disease that kill Native Americans, and so there are instances where we see that the colonists purposely give Native Americans during trade, as they trade with them, they purposely give them blankets that have been infected with smallpox, that smallpox victims have had. And so, this is really the severity of this war, no holds barred. We have something they want and they have to go away. And the Native Americans are like, no, we're not going to give up our territory. And so we see desperate fighting all up and down the frontier. And we'll resume again on our next lecture.